Rosemary Kennedy spent her entire life trying to please the people she loved. She trusted them completely, followed every instruction, and believed they would always protect her. She had no idea they were planning to erase her. If Rosemary could tell her own story, it would probably start with the warmth she felt every morning when sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Kennedy home in Brookline. The kiss she felt on her mother's cheek, soft and smelling of rosewater. Her siblings' laughter echoing through the grand hallways, a sound that made her feel like she belonged to something magical. Those moments when she felt safe, cherished, part of something bigger than herself. Because Rosemary's world was all about love, trust, and family warmth. Until that trust destroyed her. Rosemary's earliest memories were painted in golden hues of childhood innocence. She remembered running barefoot through the manicured gardens at Hyannisport, chasing butterflies while her brothers played touch football on the sprawling lawn. The texture of cool grass between her toes, the salt breeze from the ocean, the way her mother's voice would carry across the yard calling them in for lunch. These sensory memories were crystal clear, even when everything else became confusing. Playing with her siblings in the big house where every room seemed to hold adventures. Hide and seek in the library where Jack would later spend hours reading political biographies. Tea parties with Kathleen in the sunroom where they would dress up in their mother's old gowns and pretend to be elegant ladies. Building sand castles on the private beach with Joe Jr., who always made sure her castle was the tallest, the most beautiful. Her mother Rose helping her learn to read and write at the mahogany desk in the morning room. Rose would sit beside her, patient as a saint, her delicate hands guiding Rosemary's chubby fingers as they traced letters on practice paper. Yes, she learned slower than the others, but she didn't mind because the learning felt like love. Every lesson was wrapped in encouragement, every small victory celebrated with genuine joy. Because her family was patient in those early years, endlessly patient. Especially her mother Rose would work with her for hours, never showing frustration when Rosemary needed the same lesson repeated 10 times. Rose would celebrate every small progress as if it were a major achievement. "Well done, Rosemary, you wrote so beautifully," was enough to make her entire day sparkle with happiness. Those words were better than candy, better than new dresses, better than anything money could buy. Back then she knew she was different, but they didn't make her feel like it was a bad thing. Different meant special in the Kennedy household of her childhood. While Jack finished books quickly, devouring adventure stories and biographies with the hunger of someone destined for greatness, she could stay on the same page for what felt like hours, tracing each word with her finger, sounding out syllables in a whisper. While Joe Jr. solved complex mathematics problems that made her head spin, she struggled with simple additions, counting on her fingers under the table where no one could see. But her family would hug her with fierce affection and say, "You are our special girl, Rosemary. You're our angel." And she believed it completely, the way children believe in fairy tales and happy endings. The happiest moments of her childhood were when they took family photos on the front steps of their Brookline mansion. The photographer would arrange them just so, with Joe Sr. standing proudly behind Rose, who sat in the center like a queen surrounded by her court. The children would fan out around them, each one perfectly groomed, perfectly dressed, perfectly positioned. They would all come together. Rosemary would stand among them feeling important and included, smile with the radiant joy of someone who knew she was exactly where she belonged, and complete the perfect Kennedy family picture. In those photos, she felt equal, valued, loved beyond measure. She was part of something magnificent, something that would last forever. It never occurred to her that one day she would be erased from these photos, airbrushed out of family history as if she had never existed at all. But what happened next was hidden for decades. Things started to change during adolescence when something was happening inside her that she couldn't control. Fits of rage would come without warning. She would shout at her siblings, sometimes even want to hit them. She couldn't control these moments and felt devastated with shame afterward. I'm sorry," she would say over and over, tears streaming down her face. Her family was understanding at first. "She's growing up, her hormones are confused," they would say. But over time, this understanding gave way to concern, then worry, then something darker. Especially her father, Joe Kennedy's looks changed. They were no longer loving, no longer patient. They were calculating, measuring, judging. London was a lifeline for Rosemary, thrown to a drowning woman who had begun to understand she was sinking in her own family's expectations. When her father became ambassador to Great Britain in 1940, she thought it was the grandest adventure of her life. The ocean voyage was magical, standing on the ship's deck watching America disappear behind them while England grew larger on the horizon. She felt like she was sailing toward a new life, a fresh start where maybe she could finally become the person her family wanted her to be. The Sacred Heart Convent became her unexpected sanctuary, a place where the harsh judgment she had grown accustomed to simply didn't exist. The ancient stone building with its peaceful gardens felt like stepping into a fairy tale, complete with kind nuns who looked at her with compassion instead of disappointment. For the first time in years, she felt understood by the sisters who had devoted their lives to caring for others. The nuns were patient in a way that felt different from her family's patience. This wasn't tolerance or duty, this was genuine acceptance. Sister Catherine, with her lined face and gentle eyes, didn't look at Rosemary and see a problem to be managed. She saw a young woman with potential to be nurtured. They helped her write letters to her family, sitting beside her at a wooden desk in the convent's quiet library. Simple but heartfelt messages that made her feel capable again, worthwhile again. "Dear Mother, I am well and happy here in London. The sisters are kind to me and treat me with respect. I learned a new song today and sang it in chapel. The other girls clapped when I finished. I feel useful here. I hope you are proud of me. Love always, Rosemary." These were the proudest moments of her adult life, when she could hold a completed letter and know that her own hands had created something meaningful. She was learning, growing, contributing to the world around her, instead of being a burden that needed constant management. She even made friends with other girls who struggled like she did, young women whose families had sent them to the convent for various reasons. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the only one who was different. She was part of a group, accepted, normal in their small community of gentle souls. They would walk together in the gardens, sharing stories and laughter that came easily when no one was judging their intelligence or measuring their worth. When she wrote to her family about her happiness, about the small victories and daily joys that filled her life at Sacred Heart, she expected them to share in her joy. Instead, she sensed something troubling in their letters back. They were shorter, more distant, filled with news about political events and social obligations that felt impossibly far from her quiet life in London. The warmth was draining out of their correspondence like water from a cracked cup. When war broke out and German planes began flying over London, when the first bombs fell and the nuns spoke of evacuations and dangers, the Kennedy family made their decision. They had to return to America, all of them, immediately. Rosemary's heart broke when she heard the news. She begged to stay in London with the sisters who understood her, who valued her for who she was rather than who she wasn't. "Please, I'm happy here," she pleaded with her parents when they came to collect her. "I'm learning so much. The sisters say I'm helpful with the younger children. This is my home now." But they wouldn't listen. Safety came first, they said. The family needed to stay together. The irony of that statement would haunt her later when she realized what staying together actually meant for someone like her. The journey back to America felt like returning to a prison she had temporarily escaped. Every mile that took her farther from the convent felt like another chain being locked around her spirit. She pressed her face against the ship's porthole, watching England disappear into the mist, knowing somehow that she was leaving behind the only place where she had ever truly belonged. Back in Washington, everything felt wrong from the moment she stepped off the train. The new school, St. Gertrude's, wasn't like the convent where patience and kindness had been as natural as breathing. The teachers were impatient, their voices sharp with frustration when she couldn't keep up with lessons that seemed impossibly complex. The other students stared at her with cruel curiosity. Rosemary felt lost, confused, angry at a world that had promised her acceptance and then snatched it away. The progress she had made in London seemed to evaporate, leaving her more confused and frustrated than ever. The rage episodes returned with a vengeance, worse than they had been before. One night, overwhelmed by feelings she couldn't understand, she tried to leave the house. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she needed to escape. This was the moment. Everything went silent. Her father found her 3 blocks away, walking in her nightgown. The look on his face that night haunted her. It wasn't concern or love. It was calculation, cold and final. She had become their problem. The morning of November 1941 started like any other day in Rosemary's carefully regulated life, but there was something different in the air that she couldn't quite identify. She woke up in her familiar pink bedroom, got dressed in her best navy blue dress because her father had told her they were going somewhere special to see someone important. She was excited in the innocent way that came naturally to her, believing that special occasions meant good things, meant being valued. Maybe this doctor her father had mentioned would help her feel better, help her control the angry feelings that scared her so much she sometimes felt like a stranger in her own body. Her father was unusually quiet during the car ride to George Washington University Hospital, his hands gripping the steering wheel with unusual tension. Rosemary tried to make conversation, asking about the buildings they passed, commenting on the autumn leaves that painted the trees in brilliant colors. But he seemed distant, preoccupied, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. She wondered if she had done something wrong again, if this mysterious appointment was some kind of punishment disguised as help. The uncertainty made her stomach twist with familiar anxiety. At the hospital, everyone was remarkably nice to her, which should have been comforting but somehow felt strange. They called her Miss Kennedy, with the kind of deference usually reserved for her mother or her famous father. Nurses smiled at her with practiced kindness. Doctors shook her hand and spoke to her as if she were an important person whose opinion mattered. Rosemary felt a flutter of pride, a moment of feeling special in the way she craved. When they led her through corridors that smelled of antiseptic to a bright white room filled with medical equipment, she followed willingly. She trusted these people because her father had brought her here, because trust was still the default setting of her hopeful heart. When Dr. Freeman explained in his calm, professional voice that she needed to stay awake during the procedure so they could talk to her and make sure everything was going correctly, Rosemary nodded eagerly. She wanted to be helpful, cooperative, the good patient who followed instructions and made everyone proud. She wanted to do whatever would make her better, make her normal, make her family love her the way they used to when she was small, and her differences seemed charming rather than problematic. As they positioned her on the operating table, strapping her arms down with leather restraints that felt surprisingly gentle, Dr. Freeman continued to speak to her in soothing tones. "This is going to help you feel better, Rosemary. You're going to be much calmer afterward, much happier. Your family's going to be so pleased with the results." The words washed over her like a lullaby, promising a future where she wouldn't be angry anymore, wouldn't embarrass her family anymore, wouldn't be the source of whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room. As they began the surgery, making small incisions above her eyebrows while she remained fully conscious, Rosemary felt strange sensations in her head, pressure, and odd tingling that she couldn't describe. But Dr. Freeman kept talking to her calmly, his voice steady and reassuring. The bright lights above the operating table made everything seem dreamlike, surreal, as if this was happening to someone else while she watched from a distance. "Sing for us, Rosemary," he said when the procedure reached a critical point. "Sing your favorite song so we can monitor how you're doing." So she did, her voice clear and strong at first. She sang, "Let Me Call You Sweetheart," because it was the song her mother used to hum to her during those precious bedtime moments when the world felt safe and love felt certain. She sang it clearly, proudly, wanting to show these important doctors how well she could remember the words, how cooperative and helpful she could be when people were patient with her. As the leucotum moved through her brain tissue, as neural pathways were severed with surgical precision, something began to change. The words became harder to form, her tongue feeling thick and uncooperative. The melody that had once flowed effortlessly seemed to drift away from her like smoke dissipating in wind. "Keep singing, Rosemary," Dr. Freeman encouraged, making notes on his clipboard. But her voice was getting weaker, more uncertain, as fundamental connections in her brain were systematically destroyed. The song that had once brought her such joy was becoming meaningless sounds emerging from her throat. She tried to ask what was happening, why the words weren't coming out right anymore, but her ability to form coherent questions was disappearing. And then, gradually, Like a photograph fading in bright sunlight, Rosemary Kennedy, as she knew herself, began to disappear. The trusting young woman who had entered that operating room singing was being systematically erased. When she drifted into unconsciousness, the last Rosemary Kennedy died on that operating table while her body remained alive. The institution became Rosemary's new reality, though she could never quite understand why she was in this place filled with strangers who spoke to her as if they knew her. St. Coletta's in Wisconsin stretched across acres of farmland, a self-contained world where damaged people were housed away from families who could no longer cope with their existence. The nuns who ran the facility were genuinely kind, but their kindness felt different from what Rosemary vaguely remembered. This was professional compassion, trained patience, the expertise of people who had dedicated their lives to caring for those society preferred to forget. In her damaged mind, time moved differently now, flowing like thick honey rather than the rushing river it had been when her brain was whole. Sometimes she thought she was still a child, waiting for her mother to come read her a bedtime story, confused about why her beautiful bedroom had been replaced by this sterile room with white walls and a single window that looked out onto endless cornfields. Sometimes she felt a deep sadness she couldn't explain, a grief for something lost that she couldn't remember losing. The few visits from her family were stilted, painful affairs that left everyone emotionally drained. Her mother, Rose, would sit beside her bed in the visiting room, her elegant hands folded in her lap, and cry quietly while trying to make conversation with a daughter who no longer recognized her voice or understood references to shared memories. Rosemary couldn't understand the sadness that seemed to pour off her mother in waves. In her simplified understanding of the world, sadness was something that happened when you fell down or lost a toy, not this deep, persistent grief that seemed to have no beginning or end. She would try to comfort her mother the way she vaguely remembered being comforted as a child, patting her hand with awkward gentleness, offering the broken words that were all she had left. But nothing seemed to help. And eventually, her mother would leave, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Her sister Eunice was different from the other visitors in ways that even Rosemary's damaged mind could perceive. When Eunice came to St. Coletta's, she didn't cry or speak in the careful, patronizing tones that other family members used. She talked to Rosemary like she was still the same person, still someone worth knowing, still a sister deserving of respect and genuine conversation rather than pity. Eunice brought music, understanding somehow that melodies could still reach the part of Rosemary that remained intact beneath layers of surgical damage. She would sit beside Rosemary's wheelchair in the sunroom, playing a small portable radio or humming songs from their childhood, and watch for signs of recognition in her sister's vacant eyes. During one particularly meaningful visit, Eunice played a recording of "Let Me Call You Sweetheart," not knowing it was the song Rosemary had been singing when her personality was surgically removed. The familiar melody triggered something deep in Rosemary's fractured memory, a spark of connection to who she had been before. For a moment, just a fleeting moment, she remembered being someone who could bring joy to others through her voice, someone who mattered enough to sing for. The memory was like trying to hold water in her cupped hands, there and gone before she could fully grasp it, but it left her with a profound sense of loss for something she couldn't name or understand. Years passed like this in the suspended animation of institutional life, where seasons changed outside her window, but inside St. Coletta's, everything remained the same. Rosemary found simple pleasures in small things that her damaged brain could still process. The feeling of warm sunlight on her face during supervised outdoor time, the taste of vanilla ice cream on special occasions, the gentle voice of Sister Margaret reading her stories from picture books. She couldn't remember being anyone other than this person who needed constant care, who couldn't live independently or make decisions about her own life. But sometimes, in quiet moments when the medications had worn off and her mind was as clear as it ever got anymore, she felt the ghost of who she used to be hovering at the edges of her consciousness, a shadow of a girl who had once desperately wanted to make her family proud, who had trusted completely and paid the ultimate price for that trust. In her limited way, operating with the emotional capacity that remained after her lobotomy, Rosemary continued to love her family even though she could no longer understand what family meant or why these well-dressed strangers came to visit her and cried when they looked at her face. As decades passed, like pages turning in a book she could no longer read, Rosemary's story became something larger than her own tragedy, though she would never understand the magnitude of what grew from the ashes of her destroyed life. The sister who visited her most faithfully, Eunice, carried Rosemary's memory into the world through the Special Olympics, transforming private guilt into public good. Every athlete who competed in those games, every medal awarded, every moment of triumph celebrated on playing fields around the world was a tribute to the potential that had been stolen from Rosemary. In a way that would have amazed the original Rosemary, she lived on through every person who was given the chance to succeed despite their differences. The world began to change around Rosemary's small existence at St. Coletta's. Attitudes toward people with intellectual disabilities evolved from fear and shame to acceptance and advocacy. Medical ethics advanced beyond the primitive. Procedures that had been performed on her brain, the kind of surgery that had destroyed her life, became recognized as barbaric, a dark chapter in medical history. But for Rosemary herself, locked in her simplified world, these changes came too late to matter. She remained in her eternal present, unaware of the legacy growing from her tragedy. In her final years, when her hair had turned white and her face had softened with age, the caregivers noted that Rosemary seemed peaceful. She enjoyed simple routines, listening to music on the radio, feeling different textures during therapy, watching birds outside her window, and seeming to take genuine pleasure in their songs. She had no awareness of the political dynasty her family had built, no understanding that her brother had become president, or that the Kennedy name had become synonymous with American royalty. She lived in an eternal present without the burden of memory or the anxiety of future plans. When visitors came to see the elderly, Rosemary, they often remarked on her gentle demeanor that somehow persisted despite everything that had been done to her. Despite the life that had been stolen, despite the family that had sacrificed her for political ambition, despite the surgery that had carved away her personality, there was no anger in her damaged mind. She accepted care with grace, offered smiles to those who were kind to her, and found joy in moments of sensory pleasure that her broken brain could still process. Perhaps this was mercy, the blessing of damaged memory that couldn't hold on to trauma. Perhaps this was the cruelest irony of all, that she remained sweet and trusting even after trust had destroyed her. The real Rosemary Kennedy, the vibrant young woman who had sung songs and written letters and desperately wanted to please her family, died on an operating table in 1941. But her body lived on for 64 more years, carrying within it the ghost of who she had been, a living reminder of what happens when families choose image over love. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions that echo through generations. How many other Rosemarys have been silenced by families who couldn't accept difference? How many bright spirits have been dimmed in the name of respectability, sacrificed on the altar of social expectations? Rosemary Kennedy's voice was taken from her on that operating table, stolen by a father who loved power more than his daughter. But in its absence, that silenced voice speaks volumes about the responsibility we have to protect the vulnerable, to value people for who they are rather than who we think they should be. She trusted completely and was betrayed absolutely by the people who were supposed to protect her. Her story is a reminder that love without acceptance isn't love at all, that family loyalty means nothing if it doesn't extend to the most vulnerable members. In the end, Rosemary Kennedy's legacy lives not in the tragedy of what was done to her, but in the countless lives that have been touched by the advocacy that grew from her sister's guilt, the athletes who compete in her honor, and the families who choose acceptance over erasure because they remember what happened to the Kennedy daughter who trusted too much. She was erased from family photos, but her story refuses to be forgotten. Almost no one was allowed to talk about this. But now, finally, 70 years after she was silenced, Rosemary Kennedy is being heard.